Welcome to today's webinar facilitated by ICAHD UK. It's entitled, Why Can't We Get the UK Government to Support the Palestinian Cause? ICAHD UK was launched in Parliament in 2004, and from the beginning, lobbying politicians has been a core part of our work. We come from the stance that Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes and structures vital for living, now more than 58,000 demolitions within the occupied territory alone since 1967, are clear violations of international law. Although the British government uses words of condemnation, there has never been any meaningful consequences exerted upon Israel by the UK to cause it to end these and any of its other very serious violations. In fact, we wonder if the opposite is now happening. On September the 22nd, the UK's new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, told Israel's PM, Yair Lapid, that she would review moving the British embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Such a move would be a blatant violation of international law and the UK's historic responsibilities. At this time in history, we are seeing governments around the world becoming increasingly right-wing and less just. As far as Israel is concerned, the government feels that it can continue to do whatever it likes and the rest of the world will turn a blind eye. Is that true? In this webinar, we ask if there are any ways that we can engage with our government, or is this simply impossible? What can we learn from other MPs who lobby, or from other NGOs who lobby MPs? What are the best ways for civil society to affect government policy, especially with it being so pro-Israel? For this webinar, our three speakers come with specific areas of expertise. We have Clare Short, former MP, Sir Vincent Fean, former British diplomat, and lobbyist Carla McLaren. Each will speak, and then we will have a few minutes for questions. Let's begin with Clare Short. Clare Short was an MP for 27 years, and before that worked as a civil servant for 5 years. Amongst her many appointments, she served as the first Secretary of State for International Development for the United Kingdom. She is a patron of ICAHD UK and participated in one of ICAHD's rebuilding camps. Clare Short lists seeking a just solution in Palestine-Israel as one of her three major ongoing interests. Clare knows what it's like to be lobbied. What are the best ways to approach an MP, and what practical ways can an MP help once they believe in your cause? Clare, would you please answer these questions and provide any other perspectives you have for us? Thank you, Clare.
Thank you, Linda, and hello, everybody. Why can't we get the UK government to support the Palestinian cause? It's not just the UK government. I think we've got to face what it's not UK's in especially. The EU is terrible and the US, as you all know, is terrible. So we're part of a global problem. And the truth is, well, from the very beginning, when I was first politically active and got into the House of Commons, this has always been difficult. Memories of the Holocaust, films like Exodus, it's deeply unfair that a sort of blame culture coming from that should attach itself to the Palestinians, who had no part whatsoever, and no part historically, as Europeans have had in anti-Semitism. But somehow people's memory of that, of the awfulness of that, meant people didn't want to question the position of Israel. And so that's the problem's been with us a long time. That is what I'm trying to say. In fact, I remember when we went into government in 1997, and one of my first duties I took on was to speak at the Medical Aid for Palestine dinner. And in the course of my speech, I made the point that it's so unfair that the Palestinians are treated with such hostility when they had absolutely no guilt for the Holocaust. And I got screeching headlines in the Jewish press attacking me. Somehow the lobby for Israel wants to hold on to that connection, even though it's a historically untrue connection. I think, to be fair, to be frank, lobbying on Palestine has become even more difficult in recent times because of the weaponization of the charge of anti-Semitism and the use of it to attack anyone who is willing to be critical of Israel or to honestly discuss the history of how we got to the present position. I think that accusation makes people afraid. But I also think that it's been so overused recently that it's losing some of its potency and people see it more clearly for what it is. But of course, the first time it happens to you, you feel pretty overwhelmed by it. And I do think a lot of people, members of parliament, stay silent because they don't want that to come and attack them, and it makes people cowardly. But I think those are the downsides. Some of the upsides are that we have a big opportunity in relation to the rhetoric of the West, in relation to Putin's attack on Ukraine. Constantly they say the West is defending a rules-based international order. And indeed, there's continuing talk now of occupied territories in Ukraine. And of course, Israel is in grave breach of international law in many ways. And I believe for lobbying purposes that this approach is very powerful. They're making a claim and that there's Israel breaching it all, and it's topical at the moment. And I think that should be used constantly in relation to the question of the behavior of Israel in relation to the Palestinians. On top of that, the more recent powerful critique comes from the finding that Israel is guilty of apartheid. Now, clearly, those who speak for Israel hysterically respond to that to reject it. But the sources for the allegation are very serious indeed. It's not just a whimsical attack. And I think that needs to be pressed home, because virtually everyone who's in any way active in political life now is well aware of the history of apartheid in South Africa and how long it took, but the victory and the heroism of Nelson Mandela. So I think this is also a very powerful issue to use. And of course, as you will all know, people like Archbishop Tutu and John Dugard and others make clear over and over again that the nature of the apartheid in Israel is much worse and more vicious than was the apartheid state in South Africa. So as well as the general picture, which these points are meant to cover, there's the question of how to go about the lobbying and the making of contacts. The first thing I would say is that if one can get new politicians or people who are about to be elected, or even people who are already elected, onto delegations to visit the Holy Land, I think it's a transformative thing, and it tends to change people's perspective. So that I know it's not easy and organizations have to pay, but I do think if you look at some of the people who stay active for years and stay sympathetic, they often went on a visit early in their political career. So that's just always a worthwhile thing to do. The obvious thing that people do is write letters or sign postcards or sign petitions. Since I think New Labour days, this has become almost mechanistic, that both opposition parties and government prepare instant responses that are spread to everyone and the same response is sent out. It doesn't mean that it's not a worthwhile thing to do, but it means that people who receive those letters or petitions hardly have to engage with the detail unless one can find some way of getting through to them and requiring them to give some kind of personalized response. So that's a deterioration in the quality of a general political responsiveness that's happened, I think, since '97. I think it's very worthwhile. It takes more effort and organisation, but to go to see members of parliament in their constituencies. And they all have to make themselves available. And it's particularly worthwhile if one is focusing one's efforts, focusing on MPs in marginal constituencies who can't afford to ignore groups of people who come to see them. So, you know, people can stereotype, oh, this is a lefty activist on Palestine, da 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 da. But when they've got a bunch of people in front of them, and some come from the local church or, you know, some respectable local outfits, it just breaks through a bit more. So I just think people underuse that possibility, and I think it's well worth doing. So this picture I'm giving has got some negativities in it about the difficulties. But let's face it, it is difficult. There aren't any magic answers. But my view is that now, compared with, say, 10 years ago, we've got the elites, or those in political positions of power, more cautious about making any sympathetic commitments. But the general public has more of a sense that something is very wrong. I mean, it's just the constant reporting of attacks and bombings and the rest. So that even people who aren't that politically engaged know this isn't right. And that's a fertile piece of ground for us, and we shouldn't sort of forget that. But I think just as the Palestinians have to hang on, samud, keep going, not give in, we've got to do that with our campaigning. There isn't a magic bullet. We're not going to win it tomorrow. But it's of profound importance of international justice, respect for international law, the shame for the history of this country in particular, which the Balfour Project so heroically brings to people's attention. And then I want to end with this. I remember when, as a young activist, when we refused to buy South African oranges, people would laugh at us and sneer and say, how is that going to make any difference? And I remember more recently sitting in the House of Commons when Mrs. Thatcher said Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. And I also remember being in Westminster Hall, you know, where the Queen lay in state recently, where the most prestigious visitors to come to the House of Commons to address both houses are brought to. And there was Nelson Mandela, and there were the red carpets and the speakers of both House and people crowding into the seats. And the Tory MPs who'd said yeah, yeah to Mrs. Thatcher when they said he was a terrorist, or their successors, climbing over the seats to get into the picture with him. So history shifts. You don't always know when it's going to happen. You have to just keep going. Remember all those spies that we've all read so many novels about had no idea the Soviet Union was about to collapse. So it's tough, but it will change. The position is unsustainable as well as unjust and immoral and cruel. And we have to just keep going and be as smart and intelligent as we can be as we keep going, and look for those allies and hold on to them. And there will always be some, because the truth will out. And in the end, justice will prevail. Thank you. What a lovely face.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you so much for starting off this webinar. So we're now going to move to Sir Vincent Fean. Sir Vincent was a British diplomat for 39 years. His last assignment was as Consul-General in Jerusalem, where he was from 2010 to 2014. He's an Arabist. He's engaged in policy advice and implementation in Whitehall, the Middle East, and Europe. He is vice chair of the Balfour Project, where he has taken a leading role. The charity sheds light on Britain's role in Palestine before the creation of modern Israel, and advocates for peace, justice, and equal rights in Palestine, Israel. Vincent will speak to us from what he has learned from his rich experiences working as a diplomat and now trying to exert pressure on the government through his connection with the Balfour Project. So Vincent, let us hear from you, including obstacles in preventing governments from supporting the Palestinian cause. Thank you. Sir
Thank you
Vincent.
very much, Linda. Thank you, Linda. I'm in good company. Thank you, Claire, for leading us off. I look forward to getting some tips from Carla. First of all, it's good to be here. The Balfour Project that I am the vice chair of is a charity. So we're not a campaigning body as such. We advocate and we try to raise awareness. And the focus is on Britain and Britain's past doings and sayings in the region before the Balfour Declaration, during the mandate, since then. And we try to give space to people like Avi Schleim, who's on this call, to offer thoughts on a way forward. We prefer to act and speak respectfully. I know we all do. And we accept, and I know this may not be universally accepted, but we accept Israel as a state. Today I'm speaking for myself because that gives me a little bit more freedom. To try and answer the exam question, we have to engage with our government because that's where the power lies. It's the power to maintain the status quo or to change things for better or for worse. And because we live here, and this is a democracy, we can act here more purposefully than we can overseas. Although I greatly respect those who go to Palestine and rebuild. I greatly respect that action. Turning to my past job, I'd like to say that the Foreign Office and the Diplomatic Service are quite an efficient bunch. There's no shortage of facts. If an MP asks a question of a minister, it's likely that the minister will be briefed. So what I'm trying to say is that ignorance is not an excuse for the decision-making of our ministers. And the way it works is that the Consul-General in Jerusalem, where I was for 3 and a bit years, works very closely with the embassy in Tel Aviv, and let it stay in Tel Aviv, to produce the facts in a very short, concise form. The two posts, which are equal in rank, may not agree on the policy to be followed, so there can be a split recommendation at the end of the report, but the facts are shared. And that's what ministers need. They need clarity. So what you get is accurate and swift reporting, same day reporting if something happens. So ministers know the truth, is my short message. If you accept that, then the next question is, what are they prepared to do if the truth is shocking and unjust? And I believe that the occupation since 1948, 67, I mean, is both shocking and unjust. Usually, I have to say, in my experience, that ministers say what they said before. They like repeating themselves. They check back on their words if the occasion was repeated, for instance, settlement expansion. And the way the system works inside London is officials in London present options for either a statement or action by a minister. That goes up the line, as we say, up the line of command to the Minister for the Middle East, currently Lord Ahmed, in the House of Lords, which is a bit unusual, and then on, if need be, to Mr. Cleverly, with a preferred option. So an options paper, but with a preferred option. That line is discussed with the embassy and the Consulate-General, but the last word is with the minister. Ministers decide, not mandarins. So they may decide to say what they said before. And to give you one example of that, I counted, and in 2012, William Hague and Alistair Burt, between them, condemned settlement expansion 20 times. 20 condemnations of settlement development in 1 year. The key question is, what was done after the condemnation? And the answer to that is essentially nothing. The settlement expansion had no price for Israel, and that is still the case today. That needs to change. What do ministers do when they're trying to work out what to do? Well, Claire's given us a good insight, and she said it's an international issue, not a domestic UK problem. Foreign Office ministers would look to the United States, check what Biden and Blinken are doing and saying, and try to align themselves with that. They would talk to France and Germany as the two key players in mainland Europe. And because the United Kingdom is a permanent member of the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council, there is consultation there, particularly with the Americans and France, the other two Western permanent members. Ministers need to respond to the pressure of events. Also, maybe sadly, they feel the need to respond to, in the case of the Conservative government, certainly the Daily Mail. They receive a large ministerial post bag about this issue. I don't know the balance in the post bag between, if I can put it crudely, pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli letters, but I suspect that the majority of those received are pro-Palestinian. Ministers, in my experience again, are very hard to pin down when it comes to the issue of the past, particularly outside their term of office. So asking UK ministers, as we do, to take some responsibility for what's happening now in Israel-Palestine, what happened when we abandoned Palestine in 1948, the answer is either silence or that was so long ago that I cannot take any responsibility for it. But I continue to believe, and I think we should continue to say, that the United Kingdom has a historic, continuing responsibility for things that have gone wrong, and therefore a duty to work harder than most to see things go better. Linda asked me about obstacles. The relationship between the United Kingdom and Israel is multifaceted. Trade, joint ventures, medical research, academic links, intelligence sharing about Iran, defense links, defense purchases and sales. With the Palestinians, there's one issue, one grievance, a justified grievance for which Palestinians in the main, very politely, in my presence, blame us. So if you're looking at interests rather than values, we need to look at both, then British short-term interests, trade, etc., are more aligned with Israel than they are with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians present a problem. How do you confront Israel to change policy? I've tried to influence policy from the inside in my time and from the outside with mixed results. I'd agree with everything that Claire said about the ways in which people can make a difference. I wrote before she spoke about visit programs. The local Consul-General has the freedom to recommend where people go. So for instance, William Hague in 2012 went to Khan al-Ahmar and he asked the Bedouin there, where do you want to be? And they said rather charmingly, we'd like to be back where we were before 48 in the Negev. But if that cannot be, we want to stay where we are. And if we were to be moved from Khan al-Ahmar, that would be forced transfer and a war crime. William Hague absorbed that face to face. The other issues that were raised by Claire, I agree with: delegation visits, Kabu and medical aid for Palestinians, and to a limited extent, the Balfour Project are involved in those delegations. Letters, yes, the Balfour Project's tried to do letters about E1, about the attempted closure of the 6 Palestinian NGOs, about Muzaffar Yatta. Visiting MPs in their surgery, yes. And I'll just conclude by saying it's got harder in recent years. Our present government is more transactional and, dare I say, less principled than some of its predecessors. It lurches more. And here I pick up the point that you made, Linda, at the beginning, this review of the location of the British Embassy to Israel. It would be a breach of international law to move it. Trump didn't care. The United Kingdom needs to care and claims that it upholds international law and defends international law. On this issue, I believe that the Foreign Office has probably been sidelined, and number 10, in the shape of Ms. Truss, has taken the decision. I'll conclude by saying that that needs to be challenged, that review needs to be put in the place that it belongs, which is in a waste paper basket, and the embassy needs to stay where it is. And in order to do that, there are various lobbying tactics that we can come onto, including writing to your MP, including trying to reach senior Conservative figures in the current government who can influence Mrs. Truss. And I'll end by saying, to agree with Claire, we need to keep going. When we wake up in the morning and nothing's got better and things have got worse, there's a tendency to turn over, but we can't do that. We have to keep going. And I too believe that justice and truth will out in the fullness of time. I want that to be a peaceful change, and I want it to start from the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sir Vincent. Oh, how timely this webinar is in light of what's happening, and with now this much more extreme government and Prime Minister we have. Thank you for your perspectives. We're going to keep building on everything that is being shared. Our chat line is so active now with many, many questions that we'll be putting to you. But before starting on that, we've got our final speaker to hear from. And so now I would like to call upon Carla. Carla McLaren is a lobbyist on behalf of Amnesty International, managing its relations with government and parliament across several issues, including on Israel and Palestine. Carla has worked in the nonprofit sector for 13 years and specializes in human rights, women's rights, and advocacy. In February 2022, Amnesty released its report that has been referred to already this evening, entitled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, a Cruel System of Domination and a Crime Against Humanity. It's something that we applaud, but it's not yet been embraced by politicians. Carla is speaking to us straight from her involvement at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. So, Carla, thank you for joining us. And will you speak from your experience as a lobbyist?
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to join you all today. And it's great to follow Vincent and Claire. I agree with a lot of what both of you have said, and it reflects some of the points that I'll be making as well. So I'm sure, as many of you know, Amnesty is an international human rights organisation. I thought I would start off by saying that Amnesty is completely apolitical. So we don't support one political party or ideology over another. We're solely interested in respect for and upholding of human rights. And I say that because, though it's often not believed, politicians often think that we are a left-wing organisation, and we're accused of it. It is really important to focus on human rights and the international rule of law system, because when we do that, we should be able to rise above politics. And I think that by making sure that we don't fall into traps of only speaking to one side, of thinking that certain parties, naming no names, are a monolithic bloc with very little support or understanding on human rights, of using language that can be seen as political rather than impartial. But avoiding all of those things are really critical to achieving change on any issue, and certainly any of the issues that Amnesty works on, but particularly so on Israel and Palestine. So a little bit about how we lobby at Amnesty. We have an advocacy team, which I'm part of, which leads all our work with Parliament and government. And on our big campaigns, like our apartheid campaign, we will write advocacy strategies. And I thought that it would be worth mentioning that, because the apartheid campaign is an 8-year campaign. So the advocacy strategy is also long term. And that has allowed us to think about long-term objectives and the short and medium term objectives that might help us to get there. So, for example, one of the main objectives for our advocacy strategy for 2022 and 23 is actually simply to normalise the language of apartheid. I mean, I say simply, it's very difficult to do that, but it is important that we recognise the limitations of what we can do with this current government, but that doesn't mean that we should give up, and we need to really think strategically about how we lay the ground for a future government that might hopefully take a more realistic view of the human rights violations that are taking place in Palestine and Israel as well, sorry. We are lucky at Amnesty because we have local groups, student groups, youth groups across the country that we can call on to contact their MPs. And reflecting some of the things that Claire and Vincent have already said, we do that. We encourage activists to contact their MPs. We find that meetings or personalised letters can be more impactful in terms of the response that activists get back, as opposed to the sort of digital, put your name onto a pre-drafted email that then goes. As Claire said, I think MPs are quite desensitised to those kind of emails that they get, but also I think the reality is on most of the issues that Amnesty works on, and certainly on Israel and Palestine, whilst there is, I think, widespread interest in the issue, and the number of people that we have on the call today is testament to that. MPs are not going to get the kind of numbers of emails that they will have done on things, in recent times, like Brexit, like on the Partygate situation, on things like that, cost of living, MPs will be getting hundreds of emails from their constituents. And so if they're getting one or two of a kind of round robin email on this issue, it's not necessarily going to be something that they feel like they need to respond to. If I've seen in the chat that somebody was asking what you do if your MP just doesn't respond to you. Have you tried calling them? Sometimes that can be helpful if you phone them. It's harder for them to just ignore a phone call. Also, most MPs tend to have constituency surgeries, often on a Friday morning, but you should be able to find out from their website or by calling them. Often these are drop-in, or you just get given a time slot. That might be a way of actually kind of forcing a meeting with your MP. Though, of course, as Vincent said, I would highly recommend being, respectful and polite in that meeting. It's obviously very easy, and we should show our passion for the issue, but of course, a lot of MPs will have very, very differing views. I thought I would say that I guess it's fair to say that the Amnesty name can open doors in Parliament and in government. But having said that, because we work on so many different issues, I think parliamentarians sometimes don't know exactly what we're working on or what our priorities are, and we're legitimately not seen as the experts on some issues, because issue-specific organisations are really the experts. And so organisations like ICAHD and Balfour and Medical Aid for Palestinians and others that are have a very sort of singular focus, rightly, I think, are seen by government ministers and some parliamentarians as the experts. I think, as Vincent said, it's also fair to say that our access to government has declined over the last few years, and I guess it's been encouraging for me to hear that Vincent's finding the same issue. It's not completely personal. I think that may well be true of many civil society organisations, and it's also true that our apartheid report has not opened any new doors at the Foreign Office. But having said that, actually the response to our report has not been as critical or as widespread as we feared that it could have been. I think that's probably for a few reasons. Firstly, as I'm sure many people will know, Human Rights Watch released a report finding the same determination before us, and that sort of laid a lot of the ground that I think we would have faced more opposition and more challenge of Human Rights Watch. And obviously many Palestinian organisations and Israeli human rights organisations like B'Tselem had already laid that ground before we got to it. Secondly, I think that, coming back to my first point, we have tried to be scrupulous about using the language of international law and human rights violations. So, for example, we probably wouldn't use the word the Palestinian cause. We were very, very much focused on human rights violations that Palestinians experience and breaches of international law. And it's much harder, I think, for parliamentarians to criticise us on those terms. But it's also easier to kind of try and depoliticise the issues. And that's not to say for a moment that we mince our words. I think it's really important that we are strong and consistent in the language that we use, that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid against Palestinians wherever they are. But we use that international framework as the basis. We also try and be very focused on specific recommendations, both to government and also the actions that parliamentarians can take to put pressure on government. So our key asks to government, obviously we want government and parliament to recognise that the crime of apartheid is being committed. But, as Vincent was saying, really we need Israel to face concrete consequences for its breaches around international law. So we are repeatedly calling for the UK to ban the trade in settlement goods. Obviously, settlement goods are, coming from illegal settlements there, and the import of those goods legitimises that. And then in terms of asks for parliamentarians, we really tailor the asks depending on what party they are in, push them to push for progressive policy within their own party, but also to do things to put pressure on the government, like tabling questions, putting in for debates, writing letters, etc. In our experience, giving platform to Palestinian and Israeli human rights defenders who are absolutely the experts on the issues that we're discussing is very helpful. And I would agree with Clare and Vincent's point about visits. We also try and bring human rights defenders to the UK as much as we can. We actually do have a delegation from Israel and Palestine coming in October, and we'll be arranging meetings with parliamentarians with those defenders. If we can't do it in person, then we try and do it through testimony and case studies. I can't pretend, unfortunately, that we've had a lot of success with the government on this issue. I think that we are dealing with a government that is extreme in its approach to Israel and many other issues. Although it's true also that successive UK governments of both colours have been reluctant to actually hold Israel to account. But the situation has clearly hardened, and that is very concerning. I agree with Clare that I think that it's useful to try and point out the inconsistencies with the government's position in terms of their support for international justice when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They were also pretty good on international justice in relation to the Assad regime in Syria, and that is very inconsistent with the current approach to Israel. We are, in slightly better news, having some slow success with cross-party backbenchers who accept either privately or publicly that the crime of apartheid is being committed, and that they are committed to raising that within their parties and calling for the need for further action. So in summary, I would say that it's up to all of us to be direct, to be strong in our language, to be persistent, but use the language of international law and human rights violations. Be really clear about actions that parliamentarians can take, and platform Palestinian voices and human rights defenders as the experts as much as possible. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to just make a few comments now as we lead into our Q&A time. And I'll start with where you ended, Carla, because you spoke about going in, focusing on international law, human rights. You know, ICAHD has always said that from the beginning, that as an organization, we are not pro-Palestinian, we're not pro-Israeli, we are pro-human rights. You know, we look at wanting a just and sustainable solution for both people groups, but yeah, firmly embedded on international law, human rights. Somebody did put a question in the chat line about that. Is that a better way to go in to speak to parliamentarians, going in based on, you know, say with that perspective, rather than as pro-Palestinian? I'll just throw out a couple more comments as well, then before I start calling upon Clare and Vincent and you, Carla, to respond to that. I wanted to say that within ICAHD UK, we have a whole section on our website, which is about lobbying, where we give guidance for lobbying MPs, and we refer to also trying to build a relationship with an MP, trying to discover some of their likes or ways which you can connect with an MP when you start to build up a relationship and then go in to speak about your concerns. And for us, it is obviously concerning Israel's violation. And we also have encouraged people to write their own personalized letters. So on our website, you will find points to make that you use, you pull out, and then compose your own letter. But we also have sample letters as well then to give people guidance. So I hope that those in today's audience will remember that and use what ICAHD has produced as a resource for you, because we are about equipping people for campaigning. Okay, so going through some of the questions in order as much as possible that were put in the chat line. So again, in terms of engaging with parliamentarians, I'd like to go back to Clare to talk about that, building relationship, responding to them, the type of stance people take when approaching MPs to get them to engage, whether she feels that, you know, well, what has been thrown out is what MPs do appreciate. And then if we could move into something about the Israeli lobby, the strength of Friends of Israel within Parliament, if any of you then want to start commenting on that. But Claire, if I could start with you, please. If you could unmute Claire.
Yes, one of the things I think I didn't stress, and that is really important, even if the government looks pretty intractable, and I agree, things have hardened from both sides. You know, we've been on a downward course for some time, but is to find some allies, because you can't get things on the floor in the House of Commons unless you've got some committed MPs who will put down the motions or stir up the debates or ask the questions. And so being a bit strategic in looking for those allies, and it's not just personality, it's also the constituencies they represent, to be honest. I mean, some cannot afford to not be sympathetic, or if they're not sympathetic, they'll have tension with their constituents. Mm-hmm. So I think being a bit strategic to look for allies so that there are people that can be used as leaders to ask questions, press questions as issues arise that have to be answered. And then, so I mean, that requires some kind of coordination, I suppose. I mean, I don't know if in the ICAHD case, if one could have an informal way of people referring back and saying, we've had meetings with this and that, and they were really quite helpful, and please help us to have issues that we can raise with them and ask issues. Because of course, there are always events on the ground, and then you want people who will move very quickly. And the other thing that I would like to stress is we need, as well as I think focusing on international law and apartheid, we need to say, don't keep just saying that you deplore this. What are you going to do? You know, we've had too much of this for too long from governments of all stripes. And if you don't take any action, it's hard to believe that this is a sincerely held position. So I think pressing on settlement goods, which did make a lot of progress in some years gone by, and it's maybe receded a bit, and arms sales, of course, that should go on. So even if the government's tough, there are still MPs to be won. And if we take the Labour Party, and you know, this particular time with the anti-Semitism thing and Starmer's position, one might think it's hopeless. But as Carla said, these are never monoliths, even if there's total discipline. And the people who are backbenchers, especially when we get through the next election, things will ease a bit, and the people who aren't in government need a role in life, and they might as well speak up for the truth. So working away at making those alliances and getting people that one can work with who will put down the question, that's really a good investment in continuing lobbying and effort. And there's always some of that can be done, no matter how dispiriting the current situation may be.
Yes, I'd just like to say something immediately regarding that, because Claire, now, say if I write to another MP who is outside of my constituency, I get this response, you know, are you a constituent? You know, we give priority to our own constituents. So that could be harder for people who are in our audience today. I think that, you know, Carla, Vincent, and I are in a stronger position with representing organizations. It's easier for us to get to some of this.
But it just requires a bit of organisation.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously one should just do one's own letters if that's the only thing one can do. But one has relatives, friends, members of groups, alliances. I mean, just being a bit strategic about where you can get a breakthrough, because you need the backbenchers to challenge the government.
Yeah.
And getting directly to the government, especially when it's a very resistant government, is difficult. But if you've got some people sniping away on both sides, ideally, and there used to be a strong tradition. There's still a Tory Friends of Palestine. I mean, there were always some who made a stand, and they're valuable allies. So, of course, that's true, but a bit of organisation behind the lobbying actually can make bigger gains.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes. Now, Vincent, with what's been discussed so far, do you have some things to say? And I see that Avi Schleim has his hand up, so I'll call upon him in a minute as well. But first, Vincent, please.
I do. I agree with Carla and Claire that international law is the ace, really, in the hand of the Palestinians, and therefore is the one that we should be, saying a lot about. There is another angle. Carla talked about platforming Palestinian voices. That's very important. Advent is coming up for Christians, coming up to Christmas, and the Balfour Project will be asking the Reverend Mother Isaac, who's a Lutheran pastor in Bethlehem, to speak about the dwindling number of Christians in the Holy Land. And they're dwindling because of the occupation, essentially. He's also spoken on our platform against Christian Zionism. So platforming Palestinians is important. Also giving a voice to Israelis who disagree with their government and legitimately disagree with their government. There are people like the lawyer Michael Sfard. There's a small organization called the Policy Working Group, which has written a letter to Mr. Cleverly for publication, saying they're against the move of the British Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I'll circulate that to you, if I may, Linda, after this meeting, and perhaps you could send it out. In the same vein, there is a letter about international humanitarian law and the move from a couple of Canadian Canadian lawyers.
It's a superb letter. Please circulate that. I mean, it's beautifully written and it's full of serious legal points. So I think everyone should look at that and see what they can do with it.
Yeah, I think it's going into the chat, and it will go by email to all attendees afterwards. Thank you, Claire. You mentioned the strength of the Friends of Israel on both Labour and Lib Dem and Conservative sides. I don't think the SNP has much of a Friends of Israel. They are powerful. They talk about two states, at least Labour Friends of Israel do talk about two states. And I come back to the need to keep plugging away, which Claire has talked about, the need to keep plugging away. To get a parliamentary question asked, there is a mechanism, a coordination mechanism of a kind, through CABU, the Council for the Advancement of Arab-British Understanding, Chris Doyle and Joe Willits. They have links to the all-party group on Palestine, which is cross-party, not very many Tories, unfortunately, but it is cross-party. And they can suggest questions that MPs or peers might want to put. If I can answer, just to finish, Linda, for now, on one question that was in the chat from Hilary Tyrrell, can I write to Lord Ahmed? Yes. The problem is this: if you don't write through your own MP to a minister, the letter, in the Foreign Office at least, the letter goes down to quite a low degree, to a low level, to somebody who's got a word processor and a script, and who chooses some paragraphs from that script and sends it back to you. And the minister never sees your letter. If you write via your MP to the minister, including, I guess, Lord Ahmed in the House of Lords, who doesn't have a constituency, at least the minister is supposed to sign off the response, because there is a protocol that parliamentarians address parliamentarians. So my advice would be plug away at your local MP rather than writing a letter to Cleverly, unless you happen to be in Cleverly's constituency. I'll stop there.
Okay, good. Thank you for that advice. Thank you. Avi, could I ask you to please
Can I
unmute?
make one other very quick point? Sorry, Linda.
Yes, fine.
The House of Lords, now that they're parliamentarians, and most of them aren't in government. And if you look, there's a lot of former Labour MPs, there's former trade unionists, there's cross-party people who have made stands on human rights. So that is another avenue to make allies who can then use the floor of the House of Lords to raise questions. So don't rule out that group of people as a possible. Sorry.
No, very good. Thank you. Important to communicate. Okay, Avi, let us hear from you, Professor Avi Schlein.
Thank you, Linda. I find the prospect of moving the British Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem quite terrifying. And it came out of nowhere. It was floated, the idea was floated by Liz Truss when she was running for election as leader of the Tory party. And she didn't give a single good reason for a review. I know of no issue in British foreign policy which is less in need of a review than the location of the British Embassy in Israel. So if the move happened, it'd be very, very damaging to Britain, to British interest, to Britain's reputation, and it would be disastrous for the Palestinians. And it would be the end of the two-state solution. So it would be one of the most savage British blows to Palestinian statehood since the Balfour Declaration. And there have been many, many British betrayals of the Palestinians in between. Today, I published an article in Middle East Eye and made the case against the move and put forward all the legal and political and moral arguments against this idea. So if any of you is thinking of writing to your MP, you might look at my article for some arguments and ammunition. But I'd like to ask all our speakers who have spoken so eloquently and given us so many practical pieces of advice, what can we do specifically to counter this issue, which is the most pressing issue today? Thank you.
Thank you, Avi. Okay, let's start with Carla, please. Can you respond to what Avi has just said?
Yeah, yes, I will. Well, I was going to respond to some of the previous questions as well, but we can bring it all together. I think some of the things that I was going to say would be relevant for Avi's question as well. I agree with Vincent that it will be much more effective to write to your MP rather than to a minister directly, but you can be very specific in a letter to an MP to ask your MP to write to the minister to raise your concerns. Even if your MP doesn't agree with you, they have a responsibility. They won't always do it, but they do have a responsibility to pass on your concerns to the minister. And as Vincent says, the minister then has to respond to the MP. As I said earlier, I would recommend trying to ask for a meeting with your MP. That if you can do that, and I'm sure ICAHD have resources to support that, Amnesty also do, I think that will be more impactful. If you can go with a group of people in your constituency, even better. Even better, join an Amnesty group. There are local groups all over the country. I would say that, wouldn't I? But we are encouraging our local groups to contact their MPs at the moment, and I do think that going with others can show more, it can be more significant for MPs. Another thing that you could do is write to your local media, and MPs do care what is in the local media, and as Claire said, especially MPs who are in marginal constituencies. And again, if you can do that in conjunction with others or some form of group, I think that can be potentially quite impactful as well. I agree that the potential move of the embassy is very, very concerning, and obviously would, you know, it would serve to legitimize war crimes, the illegal annexation. And I think there does need to be a very strong, concerted, obvious opposition to that. Given that the UK government opposed the US move only a few years ago, I think that that's important to emphasize that as well. And the UK's signing of so many UN resolutions, as is listed in the letter that Claire mentioned that Vincent shared, I think that letter would be very useful to share. I wanted to say something also on the point around Friends of Israel. As Vincent said, I think that there can be powerful interest groups in the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, Conservatives, but it's also not unusual for states to have interest groups like that and to have that kind of pressure and PR spin. I mean, if you look at the actions that the Saudi Arabian government go to try and PR their human rights violations, so I think it's important to recognise that it's not unusual, and making the arguments that we've all talked about in terms of international law, trying to reach out to MPs that are sympathetic to try and get them to put pressure on their colleagues, that's still the best approach to try and oppose that, and to make sure that the arguments that we're all making are heard just as loudly in Parliament as the ones that are essentially propping up apartheid.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Carla. Vincent, would you like to come back and respond now? Anything else you say that Avi has just said, or anything else you've seen in the chat line?
Yep, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, to agree with Carla, this is getting a bit repetitive, but I'm agreeing with Carla and Claire because they're saying the right things. I'd like to mention the churches. I mentioned Munda Isaac and Advent and so on. Jerusalem, I'm talking about the move of the embassy. Jerusalem is sacred to 3 religions. It is not the monopoly of any one religion. It cannot be. It should not be. That's important. That's important to people of faith and to people without faith. So my part of the message tonight, in terms of lobbying on this issue, is to approach church leaders, parish, diocesan, whatever level, and say, make a noise. There are 2 sets of people who can make a noise. There are the church leaders in the UK, Anglican, Catholic, Church of Scotland, Methodist, URC, and the Quakers. And there are the church leaders in Jerusalem. They can work together if they are, so propelled. And they can be propelled by people who go to church, talking and making this point. I think that's important. I agree fully with what Avi said about the disastrous nature. If this trial balloon became more than a trial balloon, and I'm a bit scared because, having floated the balloon during the prime ministerial campaign, leadership of the Tory party campaign, Mrs. Truss then said it to Yair Lapid. So she didn't let it go. I think the Foreign Office has probably been blindsided on this, and it's a number 10 initiative. The Balfour Project has encouraged letters to MPs, and some have come back with replies, including from Conservative MPs, and I won't name names, saying privately, we don't like this, we think it's dangerous, we don't quite see the point. Rather, as Avi said, there is no reason, there need not be a review, there is nothing to review. So I think backs what Claire was saying. These parties are not monolithic, And whereas there has been quite a clear out of pro-Remain, pro-equal rights MPs back in 2019, there are still in the Conservative Party two sets of people. One, people with principle, and two, people in what they call red wall seats with a strong Muslim minority. And as Claire said, if they're in marginal seats, then those voices which will not like the idea of Al-Aqsa being under permanent Israeli control, compounded by the UK moving the embassy to Jerusalem, that is a powerful message to reach those MPs. So there are ways of influencing this outcome. I don't think it's game over by any stretch, and we do need to try and combine our forces. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to call upon Claire. Claire, just before you come in, I would like to hear from Penny and John Lee Brown. They've been very active in lobbying over the years. They're members of ICAHD UK. So if you could just briefly put your point to Claire, and then she will respond.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say, I want to emphasize that I have had a reply from the Foreign Office about the embassy move, because I wrote very early on and I used quite a few of Vincent's points as well. And they have assured me that there is no question of it being moved, that at the moment it is not on the agenda. Now, I haven't got in front of me because it's on my iPad and I can't get to it. I haven't got the actual wording, but I will send it to Linda and she can see for herself. So it may be helpful to know that that is in writing. Okay.
Thank you for that information. Now, Claire.
I'm going to be brief because we should finish, and we promised Carla, who's got, I think, family responsibilities very soon. I agree the embassy, and it's a good point to all the things we've discussed about how to lobby. Let's go for that. And we've got a government that's been full of hubris and thinking it can turn everything over, and has now had a disastrous week. So it might be feeling a bit weaker. You know, if we can get strong and push back, do they want another big row? And I'd add to Vincent's churches, mosque leaders, they must speak up too. You know, this voice should come. And of course, there's lots of committees of all churches in lots of areas. And if they speak together, that's strong. So I think, Avi, what I'd say to you is, I'll look at your article. The letter that Vincent has circulated is a brilliant letter. And let's push on it when the government's weak. Suddenly, this great stroppy government that thinks it can turn everything over is in a lot of trouble. So let's push them back at that moment and take it as an example of the lobbying we can do. Then we can get back to apartheid and international law. And I'll stop there because of time.
Okay, thank you. Well, yes, we are going to have to bring this meeting to a close. It is recorded. Come back, listen again, and act. So first, I do want to thank you, Carla, for joining us on behalf of Amnesty, Sir Vincent, representing the Balfour Project, but also speaking in a personal capacity from his experience, and to Clare Short as well. It's been, well, I've found it really useful, and I trust everybody here as well has. I want to say that we are now being released to go out to see these letters. You can access them through the ICAHD website and respond. Do that as a first action. ICAHD UK has had a webinar scheduled for October, and we've just changed it because there is going to be an important meeting. This would be probably the second point now to go to our government about, because it's the BDS bill. And so the International Center for There we are. Justice for Palestinians has arranged for there to be a public meeting Monday, the 17th of October in London, St. George Street. So it'll be live streamed and it will be recorded. So whether you can be there face to face or view it from a distance, do attend that. This is about silencing, campaigns, activists, whether you're involved in climate change or the arms trade or other aspects of campaigning. This is important to attend. ICAHD UK is part of the group, a wide, diverse group of organizations really pushing back against the government and making changes there concerning boycotts. Then the next ICAHD webinar is going to be on the 23rd of November. We're bringing Andrew Feinstein back in conversation with Jeff Helper. This is part 2, following on from the June meeting. And Andrew Feinstein's a South African academic, writer, former member of the South African Parliament. And they will be talking about the campaigns, the anti-apartheid campaign, struggle for liberation, all these different aspects from that experience and plugging it into Palestine. Okay, do check the ICAHD website for our campaigns, learn more about us as an organization. We have a diverse number of campaigns, from home demolitions to One State to JCB, NSPCC. Check out our multiple campaigns, subscribe to our newsletter, actions you can take. These come out monthly. Again, we are about equipping campaigners for different types of activism, including lobbying. Okay, I hope I've remembered everything. And again, to say ICAHD UK is political. We are not a charity, and that's why we are so dependent on civil society to get behind us and support us every way that they can. Thank you very much to everyone for attending. We really appreciate your presence and that of our outstanding speakers, and also our contribution from our other patron, Abby Schlein. Thank you so much. Hope to see you soon. Thank you. Bye.